Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be joining from today, and welcome to our final session on our third day of Artlogic Connect 2024. My name is John Duff, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at Artlogic, and we're absolutely thrilled that you've been able to join us. Before I kick us off, I'm going to pass over to our President and Chief Commercial Officer, Joe Elliott.
Thanks so much, John. Well, welcome, first of all, and thank you everyone for joining our final panel of Artlogic Connect 2024. And what an event it has been. Over the past 3 days, we've held 12 panels and had over 3,500 people attend, which far exceeded any of our expectations. So from all of us here at Artlogic, we really just want to say a big thank you for coming and joining all of the conversations this week. It's been wonderful to see so many familiar faces, or at the very least, familiar names popping up in the Zoom meeting, joining discussions, and also seeing clients and our wider Artlogic community from all over the world come together to learn and to share ideas. And finally, a big, big thank you to all of our moderators and panelists throughout the last 3 days, without whom none of this would be possible. So with that, and I know we're all eager to get going, I'll pass it back over to John and we can kickstart our final panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. And this is our final session, which is focused on beyond election day, macro challenges facing the art market in 2025. The panel will be sharing their insights on how they plan to cope with uncomfortable macroeconomic conditions, larger cultural trends, and technological advances poised to impact the art trade of today and tomorrow. So the session will include a panel discussion. It's going to last about 30 to 45 minutes, and then it will be followed by a Q&A, which will be 15 minutes. If you've been to some of the other sessions, you'll see that we get lots of questions, so we are going to try and get through as many as possible, but we can't promise we'll get to all of them. Do note the Q&A section is a public forum, so please make sure all of the questions and wording are appropriate for all audiences. And if you do need to step away at any time, don't worry, the session is being recorded. We will send it out next week. Every session will be available on demand, so you can watch it at your leisure. It's now my pleasure to introduce our final moderator, Tim Schneider, who will guide us through this exciting discussion. Tim is the founder of The Grey Market, an art industry newsletter recently relaunched on Substack. I recommend you sign up, and a private consultant and artist and business and for businesses as well. A former art market editor for the Art newspaper and art business editor for Art News, he brings a data-driven approach to analyzing the art trade. Please join me in welcoming Tim to the virtual stage.
Thanks, John, and Joe also. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the panel. Thanks for joining us today. I just want to take 1 second up front to say that, as the title of this panel indicates, we've got a lot of ground that we are going to try to cover here today. And although that we are definitely going to get into the outcome of the US presidential election, I think that everybody on the panel views that particular twist as only the latest in what I would describe as kind of the eternal macroeconomic labyrinth of trying to make, exhibit, or sell art for a living. So what we're going to try to do here today in this panel is to focus as much as we can on practical strategies and practical solutions to try to help all of you in the audience navigate whatever is going to come next, regardless of whether it's Donald Trump or tariffs or any number of other things. So without going any further into that on my own, let me take a moment to introduce our illustrious panelists. And if each of you could just turn on your camera once I introduce you, that would be fantastic. Let's start with Katey Acquaro. Katey is the director of Silverlens New York, which she helped launch in 2022 when the gallery expanded from its longtime headquarters in Manila. She was also previously a partner and the director of production at the Independent Art Fair. Next up, Nick Olney is the president of Kasmin, which is a role he's held since 2020, and in which he oversees the gallery's 2 locations in New York and its roster of 40 artists and states. And last but certainly not least, Jasmin Tsou is a director of Lisson Gallery in New York. She was also previously the owner of JTT Gallery, also in New York, from its founding in 2012 until its conclusion in 2023. Thanks for joining me. Let's just deal with the elephant in the room right off the bat. Could you tell me which aspect of the forthcoming second Trump term is having the largest effect on your forward planning at your gallery?
Uh, I
Everybody
guess,
really eager to answer this one, clearly.
I mean, I think as a, for Silverlens, which is a gallery that was founded in Asia and moved to New York, there's just this big question of what does it mean to be an international business in a time of US protectionism and isolationism and all of the, economic policies that come from that.
And I think for us, I mean, depending on what was going to happen this election, we also felt like getting past the election was going to hopefully be able to refocus everybody on our various tasks at hand. I think that is what we'll all do, but I think a lot still remains unclear about which economic policies are going to be put in place and how we're going to react to those as well. I mean, we've seen a bump in some of the stock markets and things too, but like which policies may be inflationary, how are potential tariffs, and thinking about like all three of our galleries are active in Asia, how that might affect things. But also, even in the first Trump administration, it's not like all of the tax policies were totally beneficial to the art world too. Like in the 2017 tax code, the 1031 like-kind exchanges for secondary market art purchases were eliminated too. So there's a lot that remains to be seen. So we just have to be ready for what comes, I think.
Yeah, I have kind of two hats, of course, because I can sort of speak from being in a smaller gallery and what my experience from owning JTT was. And a lot of that, when I think about Trump, really turns into more abstract things about meaning, about where we are as a society, like what role art plays, how, a lot of the things that are in dialogue in the press right now is how removed the Democrats and how elitist the Democrats have been. And of course, we are the most elite community in all of America, or at least we're certainly perceived that way. There's a lot of communities within our art community, and there's many of us that do not identify as that, but that's how the country sees us. And so I think a lot about what does the role that art, what role does art play, and how are we interacting with our sort of larger American community? Again, that's as like a business owner in New York. Sort of speaking from my hat as being a director at Lisson and only really being here for a year now, so I can't speak so much as an expert on an international business. I don't want to be so presumptuous, but it is very interesting to think about just how many components are a part of this larger company and how many artists are involved in it and how it will affect every artist differently depending on where they are. And so I think a lot of the focus right now is just thinking about how these different markets within our larger market are going to be affected and how we have to be flexible with all of those upcoming changes.
Yeah, speaking to what Jasmin was just saying, art galleries are not just a single business. We are kind of like umbrella organizations over a number of small businesses, all of which have different needs and are at different places. And so it just adds other layers of things to always think about, because you're trying to do well for everybody in your community, but also people are working at artist studios, at artist families, at estates as well too, but all the constituencies that we work with, including our audiences, we're sort of part and parcel with all of this.
And also just like, obviously it's a very global business, and thinking about just which regions will come to the top as things go sideways. You can imagine like certain art fairs become very difficult or more easy based on policies, but also the strength of the dollar and all of these things. So I think that's high on our mind for sure.
I think that what everyone is sort of circling in one way or another here is just that we're in this sort of strange place, because on the one hand, everyone recognizes that this is this kind of hinge moment where you have a new, very, let's say, well, we have a president coming in who is going to have very strong opinions about the ways that things should be done. And we can't really necessarily anticipate all of the effects that's going to have, even if we have a general sense of what the policy changes might be. The specifics matter a lot. And so it's really difficult, I think, to sort of figure out in advance all of the moves that you might make in response. And it really just ends up being about kind of this idea of maximizing flexibility, putting yourself in the best position to be like, okay, if this happens, then we can do this. But if this other thing happens, we're prepared for that also. I mean, does that sound right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that's pretty clear is that the world goes through periods of greater change at certain moments than others, and there seems to be a lot in flux, and the landscape is changing a lot. So some of that's based on technological shifts, the fact that it is truly interconnected and global now, but there's a lot of other cultural things going on, a lot of complexity and rapid change. And I think whenever you have those periods of change, there's also great opportunities that come about too. But I think one of the things strategically is that we think about is like how to be the most adaptable. And I think for us, the program has always been, and really this is kind of based on an intellectual curiosity, but it's always been a number of artists who are active in different markets. So artists at different stages in career and from different places and things too. So having both having sort of your clear focus of what you want to do, but also being engaged in a lot of different markets, both geography and type, is interesting because it does give you this certain adaptability because you're talking to a lot of different people. And I think the art market is very hard to make general statements about. It's not actually one monolithic market. It's a conglomeration of many, many markets, including as granular as like each artist has their own single market. And then sometimes even series or bodies of work for an artist that's had a long career, each have a market too. So it's trying to maintain all of that complexity while also being really decisive about what you're doing and what you want to do.
I'm going to try to pin this down to some specific kind of tensions within the state of things right now. And one of those is cost. Now, we all know that just having heard about and experienced the runaway rise in inflation over the course of the past several years, costs have gone up. Who knows what's going to happen if Trump comes in and there are a whole bunch of new tariffs or whatever else. But I'm just wondering from the standpoint of what's already happened, could you talk a little bit about which of the rising costs of actually running a gallery have had the greatest impact on your business and sort of how you've tried to adapt to them?
I can speak a little bit about JTT because it was like just thinking about the time period, definitely it was always shipping and material costs. I remember when I was doing construction on my Broadway space, my mother's side of the family is all in construction, and they were all like talking to me about how to save 5 cents per, plywood. There's like a whole plywood market at that time in the 2020s about like, oh, you got to buy a bunch of plywood and you can resell it. Like they were talking about it like it was Bitcoin. Because of just the supply chain. So I think that there's an aspect of that. But there's one thing I kind of want to bring up in relationship to cost that I think a lot of people don't. I'm going to kind of try something out here because a lot of people don't talk about it this way. I think a lot of times in the market, we think about the value of an artwork attached to that artist and their career. But when you're in the gallery, you're thinking a lot about your costs in relationship to the price of these artworks. And of course, you can't really price your artwork relationship to your costs, but the fact that you can't is absolutely wild to the business owner and a business operator. And so I think what was really tricky for me about that time period in 2021, 2022 is that when your inflation and costs are rising higher than you're able to increase the value of the works to make up for that, that is really what we're talking about in terms of costs. Costs aren't an issue when you can raise the value of the work and the artist's career and not feel like you're in any way taking it, like that everybody is feeling excited about the opportunities to both acquire and sell the work. So I think that's the moment that we've all been kind of struggling with for the past couple of years. Again, this is speaking from JTT, not so much but yeah, I just think it's a tricky thing. And then you kind of get into a situation where I know clients feel confused when prices go up and they feel like there's dealers that are being greedy, but our costs have just increased so much that this business has become just so incredibly expensive. And so there's just so much risk. And I want to add that the reason why shipping and material costs or any type of costs go up is because a vendor on the other end is trying to mitigate their risks. And I think what can be tricky about in the dealer position is it's very like how to mitigate risks, I think is a very interesting strategy. I think a lot of us go about it wildly differently. I took all my risks. I took any risk possible at JTT. But I really respect and value dealers that can figure out how to really make bold moves with their program while not bringing the risk into the lives of their artists and their staff.
Mm.
Well, speaking of artists, I want to focus on them for a minute because I always feel like when we have these sort of broad spectrum conversations about the market or the state of the business or whatever, we tend to spend a lot of time talking about dealers and about collectors, but I feel like the artists often get lost in the shuffle somewhere, which is sort of wild given that they're the whole reason that any of the rest of us has a job. Because if they weren't making the art in the first place, I don't know, the rest of the thing kind of falls apart. So I was just wondering, in terms of these kinds of moments of turbulence in the market and the world at all, what are the effects on your artists? Like, how do you adjust to their needs as a gallerist in the context of these larger forces that we're talking about?
I think like we actively end up doing a couple of things, one of which is more coaching to help shore up the ship of it. And, like you said, in the interest of being super practical, it's like everybody needs kind of two categories of work, things that are incredibly ambitious and just everything the practice could be, and then things that are realistic and could actually, be in someone's New York apartment. And so help figuring out how to do both of those things, but with integrity. And, in the ideal world, they're not separate. Like the apartment things are sort of a pipeline or a foundation for the larger things. So it becomes a more, the integrity is the word that comes to mind. And then the other thing is, as artists need more support and the gallery needs to step in and provide more support on various levels, like contracts become really important because that just clarifies what everybody will give everybody. It's a method of protection to kind of clarify the terms and preserve the relationship long-term as well.
And I think also at sort of the city level, there's also about the formation and sustaining of artist communities as well too. And I think real estate prices are kind of inversely proportional to creativity and risk taking in a lot of ways too. And when you see the world becoming very international, and certainly the art market become very international. So as galleries, you see a lot of shipping rising also because of that, and for clientele and for artists. But cities that are investing in kind of cultural capital and looking to make an art center, a lot of times those policies seem to be very top down in terms of events, museum building, galleries and things too, and not necessarily creating that space for where artists can have inexpensive rent to really be and to create, and for writers or other, like everyone else in an ecosystem that creates like actual intellectual exchange and creative processes and dialogues and things like that. And if you lose some of that, it becomes kind of very bifurcated, where like artists have to move out of cities, or they can't, you're not getting all of that same type of fertile ground for people to really innovate.
Yeah, I also feel that artists are tremendously powerful in our industry. Of course, it's not just that they are the reason why we have jobs, but they drive the values of our system. I feel like what artists want out of their career, or what galleries tend to shape their building, their businesses after. But in a way, I don't know how much we sort of talk about it. I just think we make assumptions and presumptions about it. And so I do try as best as I can to sort of talk with artists about where they want to be, what their values are, and sort of back engineer things after that. But sometimes it's just one of those things that is moving as you're building it, and your needs and wants change. But there's just so many different ways to be an artist in this system, and there's so much different levels that you can be successful. So trying to kind of create more of an expansive understanding of what the possibilities are, I think, is very important.
Jasmin, out of curiosity, do you feel like you have more space to have those kinds of conversations now that you're a part of kind of a larger organization that you did when you were running JTT on your own?
I think, without getting like too into it, speak a little abstractly, I think with JTT, what was just hard is that like the artists and I were so close that I think that it felt a little bit like they necessarily had a bit of pressure to kind of help keep the lights on. We had a sort of small program, I think, relative to what our expenses ended up being. And I think what's really great about creating a little bit more structure and different types of galleries outside of JTT, because I don't think it's just Lisson, but I think like sort of creating a little bit more boundaries. We just started JTT. I started JTT when I was very young. I was in my 20s, and we were just kind of like a family. But I think that sort of creating a little bit more separation so that the artist doesn't feel that pressure from the business, but can sort of build and create autonomous from the business is really where you produce the best work. And I think, of course, I believe that we should inspire each other and sharpen each other. And, I always give criticism in studio visits, so partially because I get excited about dialogue. So I think that those are the types of, for lack of a better word, the type of intimacy that an artist and a dealer should have. But I think creating more separation is so healthy for both sides of the business transaction.
I think
No, it's super. Oh, you go, Nick.
For us, I feel like 2020 and the pandemic lockdown was also an incredible opportunity to have some of these deeper conversations internally about values. And I think also coupled with a much needed 21st century civil rights reckoning that still and under this Trump administration is going to be very present in the lives of many community members of all the communities we're engaged with. And but also for the gallery, that was when our founder, Paul Kasmin, passed away too. So we had a lot of really amazing, frank conversations with our artists and with the team about what our values are, what our mission is, why we're doing this. And I think a lot of people in the art world were having those conversations. And then we're like, it's been something you have to kind of constantly manage in terms of what you pull forward and what you pull with that time and clarity you had versus this kind of elastic snapping back, like a memory elastic to the pace of art fairs, exhibitions, et cetera, too. So I think everyone's kind of negotiating what they sort of are in it for, and then what the realities of the market are sort of propelling in our businesses. So the ways that you stick with that and carry it forward, I think, is really, really critical, and something I pay a lot of attention to and think about a lot. In some ways, I don't know I'm curious, like what we all sort of learned, because so much of it snapped back to what it was previously in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Kind of similar to what you said. So it really was, the chaos of the first Trump presidency that allowed Silverlens to jump to the US for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, just thinking back to 2020 and the summer of protests, and really that summer and the Black Lives Matter movement actively put cracks into this system. And there was just enough light, our founders, Isa and Rachel, visited New York in the summer and were walking around, that summer and fall, and saw that like so many of the shows on the street, in Chelsea, in the couple of blocks where all of our galleries are, were Black American artists. And, they just thought like, oh, we could be next. And there was a lot of financial upset, and so a space became available, and all of these things enabled the gallery to be there. And then also at that same time, like, Stop Asian Hate, a lot of museums now have either curators of Asian descent, or like entire departments donated to Asian art. So all of these things happened, more significantly in the last 8 years. And then the other thing was Zoom connecting the world. So the Philippines has been so literally and conceptually far away for so many people until Zoom became a relevant and accepted way of contact. So all of those things created opportunity, like to Nick's point about things changing, changes things.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that I feel like is really important to try to contextualize this current moment within. I feel like every time there are one of these seemingly big ruptures, there's a kind of sense that like all of this is completely new. In reality, I mean, all of you have been in business in one way or another for long enough that you've been through multiple ruptures of some kind or another before. I mean, whether it was COVID, whether it was the first Trump administration, depending on how long you've been doing this, the great financial crisis, all those kinds of things. And I feel like there have to be just like lessons that get learned every time you survive a cycle like that, that the next time something in that vein comes up, you have a sort of well of resources to pull on, and you'd be like, okay, well, this reminds me of this, and that worked back then, or that didn't work back then. Let me try to do this now. I mean, are there any ways in which these kind of previous inflection points in the world and how you responded to them at the time, are there any ways in which that's helpful now as you try to figure out how to move forward with the business during this next stretch?
I'm trying to think from my side. I mean, it was interesting. It started my career in San Francisco when there was that initial .com crash, and then some of it has been sort of economic, and then 2008 too. But I think just the knowledge that you can be very adaptable, and right now what you're seeing in the market is not that type of financial downturn like we saw in either of those two. But I think it's more the lesson to really just focus on your artists and focus on the program and on the work. I really think the best, it sounds kind of deceptively simple, but like the best strategy for artists is to have the best material and the best art, and to really help provide your artists that kind of space to make their best work and to bring interesting things in. So it's just to really stay relevant and to stay really high quality, and to make sure you're really connecting in person to like and directly with people you have relationships with, not to have relationships just be via email or data and things like that, like sort of picking up the phone, seeing people, going to visit clients, et cetera, too, and like maintaining, despite all this sort of technological disruption, all this connectivity. And Zoom does really help for that too, is to treat people well in every aspect of the business and at every time frame. I think that's why always trying to treat clients well. I speak with a number of people from the collector side too, where they feel like there are gallerists who treat them when things are really, really booming versus when things are slowing, that they sort of are treated differently at different moments too. And it's like trying to be someone that they feel like they can trust at any point. And we found that making sales in 2020 with the lockdown is having relationships for a long time, where people knew that like someone wanted to make a decision about something, but they couldn't necessarily see it in person. And they knew that I would give them a a great description of really what I thought, what made a particular work interesting, and give them that kind of I don't know, that kind of insight that comes with trust over time. So I think being trustworthy is probably one of the best ways to get through any situation, any period of turbulence.
I have a kind of like, this is like the opposite of the silver lining. This is just, I'm going to go dark cloud for a second here. Sorry. But it's just that for any of you that are listening to as many news podcasts as you can find, I think a lot of people are talking about the New World Order. So if you kind of think of like a 30 or 40-year period starting from the Depression up until the Cold War, and then the Cold War until now, then we're entering into a new world order where our values and who we are as a society, especially American society, are being created and formed. So my response to your question, Tim, is not so much that I feel like, oh, from, I started my gallery in 2012, which was kind of after this 2008 crisis. I think of it more like we're kind of entering into like a 30 to 40-year period right now, whatever. This is really dark thoughts, but I think if we're being honest, whatever decisions Trump makes and how they affect the Supreme Court and how they affect our justice system, we are entering into a totalitarian regime. That's not a joke, it's real. How whatever structures or pillars of, America is not a great country if you think about liberty or anything like that. Its concepts are stolen from indigenous people. These are things I believe, concepts of freedom. So yeah, I don't have any answers for how we're gonna enter into the next 30 or 40 years, but I think that's what's happening.
Well, let this be a lesson to everybody in the audience who has never talked to me before, that having a conversation with me has a tendency to put people into the darkest possible timeline, no matter what the subject is. So beware. I want to return to something now that we're in this kind of mindset of just sort of like, what do you do when you feel like things are bad, basically. And Katey, when we were preparing for this panel, you said something to the effect of, when you go through these periods of volatility in the market, you have to become really clear as a gallery about your mission statement and really, really clear about who your audience really is. Because when you're in these times of turbulence, those are the people that you can really depend on and kind of hunker down with if you need to, and kind of figure out a way through. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what that looks like in practice?
Yeah. So yeah, extreme clarity about mission statement. And who you serve. And the other thing is, being in New York with like hundreds of world-class galleries, such as Jasmin's and Nick's. So, to put it back to us, thinking about, we are a gallery from Southeast Asia that represents 33 artists, like 60-70% of them are from the Philippines, if not the broader Southeast Asian region. So that is what we were built on. And what does it mean to do that here in North America? And so a list that has been like created over time by all of us is who do we serve? Okay, so who do we serve and who are allies? First of all, to Nick's point, like existing clients, existing people who come to your gallery, the community already that you have and have a symbiotic relationship, number one. Number two, for us, people of the diaspora that are looking for a portal back to home or ancestral home in the region. Like, that's a huge part of what we do. And most of the programming, we do a lot of talks and performances at the gallery. Almost all of it is for those people. That's the community. Thinking in terms of sales and institutions. So the next would be the largest institutions, which have the basis of Asian art collections already, or have had the bandwidth to have like a proper curator dedicated to this. And then the fourth one that has become really clear over the past 2 years are university museums. because university museums are actively on the forefront trying to make their collections reflect their student body. And so like those 4 things, I have the list in my notebook, are really a guiding light for us. So putting that into practice.
Does that kind of process resonate with anyone else on the panel? This notion of really trying to drill down in a very fine-grained way about who it is that your audience is. Like I have to imagine that that becomes a tougher and tougher thing to do as the size of your gallery expands. I mean, Nick, I'm kind of like looking in your direction as I say that.
Yeah, and I think, well, also we've been really looking to also expand our audience and our community as well too. We're a gallery that has shown a lot of very canonized artists from the US and from Europe as well too, and also realize, you know, in both before 2020, but really having full control over with the team over the programming here has also been to make the program more contemporary, and having the historical work that's in our program and the contemporary work really be in active dialogue with one another. And so it's both been sticking to your core communities, but also opening it up and trying to expand. Like I've always loved the fact that people can come to the gallery without necessarily knowing what will be. It's not something that's tied closely to a specific region or to a particular aesthetic, but that they'll hopefully be surprised, but also have a real continuity of quality and range and kind of understand the intellectual pursuit that's behind it. So it's been a combination of shoring up our core audience and also expanding it.
Yeah, I would say that like Katey's sort of strategy as it's laid out is very familiar for me, but just maybe for slightly different reasons for why I would have built a similar structure or strategy for reaching out to certain curators. And mostly just America can be really regional in and of itself. New York can be really myopic. When I first started the gallery, I was really interested in investing a lot. A lot of my program came out of Philadelphia when I first started, and I spent a lot of time there and a lot of time in Chicago, and kind of spending just time in these parts of the country that have really incredible museums that if you're just a little bit of a snobby New Yorker, you're not paying as much attention to. And the more attention I paid to programs outside of New York, the more I learned and got excited about the curators and what they were doing. And, you know, obviously being a curator is challenging for a lot of reasons, because you have to move all around the country for different job opportunities. And so to kind of follow curators as they move around the country is always fun, and watching how they develop their own careers and following people for now 2 decades. You know, it's really, I get excited by seeing how people develop what they're interested in. Of course, there are all these politics that are part of the subcontext, but I think kind of knowing people individually for a long time, I get more excited just knowing what they're personally interested in, things like that.
Yeah, and that's having those long-term relationships is exciting too. I just think sort of demographically, for me, having been in the business for a little over 20 years and coming into my late 40s, a lot of sort of cohort of people who I came up with and met in different capacities all around the world, seeing them, new generations of people coming into positions of power, and actually being able to really add to the cultural production of museums and galleries and contemporary art, and it's like super exciting and really gratifying. So I think there's with all this tumult, I think there's so much talent in the art world right now. There's a lot of noise and a lot of things to cut through, but it's also a really exciting time to be in this world and in this industry.
Yeah, I think that's a great note for us to transition into the audience Q&A portion of this on. Just this notion that, yes, this is going to be a time of upheaval and things are going to get thrown in the air, and they already have been, but you have the opportunity to go out there and really, as long as you're willing to be open-minded and creative and adaptable, there could be some really great opportunities that arise out of this. So we'll end on that moment of hope. John, you want to come in and
Lovely
help
moment of hope.
us?
I love that. So I'm going to read out the questions and Tim's going to help me field them out. And we've got one that starts off, and I'm going to preface the Trump administration, the values he has been strongly advocating for. How do you think they will impact the art industry? And what from his first term can we see maybe being repeated in his second? Who would like to take that one?
I have a guess at how something in particular might shake out. So dangerous to guess, but let's try. So I can imagine kind of like two parallel things happening, one which might influence bigger galleries and one smaller galleries. So I think you can imagine there being both like a real, a specific backlash to US isolationism leading to a desire in the kind of cross-cultural, international in the art industry. So that would be bigger galleries. But then you can also imagine that due to these various like kind of economic implications, there would be a simultaneous focus on the regional in some ways, you know, cut shipping costs and some of these more complicated things. But in these sort of regional efforts, community, you know, like a strong community arises. So a lot of the new like fairs and art models you see coming out are people trying to really focus on a specific kind of community in the US. So that's a guess that I have.
I think there's two kind of ways to read that question. Sort of the way that I understand it is like what art might be made based under this sort of political environment, and that is also very hard to guess. But the second way to read it is sort of like, how does history get written about this period? And for me, that's always found in the museums, or it isn't at the moment, it's found in the museums and how museums are acquiring and receiving work. And you know, we are, the government does not fund a lot of the arts here in America, individuals do. And so it'll kind of come down to perhaps the pressure that museums feel around receiving certain types of gifts, or what types of generosity comes from individuals in terms of wanting to donate. I'm sure there's plenty of individuals out there that will make some very exciting, will participate in a very exciting way in writing history, but I think we have a little bit of autonomy in that way. There is, of course, always going to be ways in which tariffs will affect our industry, but just speaking for America, at least, that's, you know, we have a chance, I guess.
I think you think of institutions too. You also see not just in the Trump administration, but various changes of administrations and policies really affecting museums. Like in England, the cutting of funding to museums and institutions really having effect on programming, or, you know, in other countries that have had more history of government support of the arts too, even if it's still very limited. But in Mexico, having so much of the government support taken out of institutions, when you don't have necessarily some of the tax benefits of giving and things like that too, it's like you see a lot of the stress that's on museums throughout the world, but in the US also lots of I think we're also in the midst of a lot of culture war activity and a lot of rhetoric from people in power and coming into power too. And it's something that we're going to have to grapple with too. So I think for museums, both being a real like point of intersection for a lot about culture, and then also that being connected with money and funding, it's a really, really tough time to be a museum director or a curator too. I think we all have to do our best to support these institutions. They're super, super important for what we do. They're facing challenges on multiple fronts all the time, you know, even more than we do as businesses, as galleries.
Tim, do you want to jump in, or should I move to the next question?
I guess the one thing that I would add to that is, to some extent, I feel like a lot of it will end up depending on what happens with the stock market. I mean, the reality is that, as Nick was just nodding to, a lot of this industry ends up revolving around what's happening in the portfolios of very wealthy people. And although it's really kind of up in the air right now as to whether, by and large, whatever is going to happen in a second Trump term is quote unquote good for the economy or bad for the economy, I think that we in this industry really do still depend ultimately on what's happening among the wealthiest people. And if the stock markets do well under the new administration, then that's going to lead us in one direction. And if it goes off the rails in some way, that's going to take us in completely another. So that's just another thing that will remain to be seen, I think.
So the next question is, there seems to be a big discrepancy between primary and secondary prices. Is this a concern? And it seems to be growing. So how does anybody on the panel feel about this?
I'm curious for more information on what they're referring to specifically, or unless somebody else can answer this without. Because I think it depends on which market is for secondary and which market for primary.
Sadly, don't have any more information on that.
Well, I mean, let's just try to game this out. I mean, I can tell you from the standpoint
I've
of,
just got an update. It's auction
okay.
prices are often half of gallery prices.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to make sure, because I mean, it depends on if you're talking about credible secondary works of artworks that are made in the 80s and 90s now, you know, that's like a different thing. And that is also sort of, you can get great historic objects now. And I mean, this is such a cheesy response, but I really think that like it's such a great buyer's market right now. I'm so confused why car collectors are complaining about cheap prices. I would be buying it all up if I were you. But you know, that's just like a short answer.
But then, yeah, because you also see maybe young and very hot artists whose secondary markets really balloon up past primary markets, and how that's managed is also a challenge, and how galleries can really work with artists long term to build prices and markets slowly over time so that they're real markets too. But it's also one of the issues with the amount of data that's out there. So if someone's looking at a artist that a work of ours, and they're looking at some auction data and asking for more information, that really work to give them why this went for this, why that one went for that, and that these are data points that need to be seen in a broader context so that it makes sense to people. And then you've got primary and secondary prices in terms of, I guess in the secondary market, just having buyers' expectations align with sellers' expectations, and that's a lot of what we try to do, is bring them together if you're working on selling something secondary. So I guess there's a number of factors at play all the time.
Great. Well, let's move on to our next question, which is, what data or data sources do you look at when you want to build out your next part of where you want to, next area of growth or business strategy? Or does it come about a bit more organically from tips or insights that you hear on the ground?
I mean, I think what Jasmin said earlier is just like, be really up on the news, like, but beyond just your domestic country, really important. Obviously read, all the reports that come out about the art market, because of the opportunity cost of not reading them. Like you gotta know at least. It's interesting because a lot of it just doesn't really reflect the region of Southeast Asia, so it's not applicable. Financial Times and Nikkei Asia are good. But then in terms of actual decision making, personally, so we do really kind of extensive data on every show and fair we do. And then what's most informative is connecting the trends like across those reports, the return on investment from an exhibition versus a fair and various fairs and all of these things. So I guess to sum up, definitely be aware, but also analyze your own data the most.
Yeah, I think that there ends up being, and I'm speaking from the standpoint of somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about the way that data functions in the art market. I think Katey's point is really important in terms of even if you don't consider yourself to be a very data-driven decision maker, it's important to understand like what the dominant narrative out there is, because you're going to be encountering people who have it in their head from the latest Art Basel and UPS report or the latest Art Tactic report or whatever it might be of the way that things are. And if that's not actually reflective of your program, then it's important for you to have that kind of grounding so that you can actually say, okay, well, yes, I understand that that is one story that's out there about some segment of the market, but let me tell you about what we've experienced here. And it becomes more of a, I don't know, I don't want to say it a defensive mechanism, because that makes it sound like you're actually like getting defensive about it. But I think it's important that data ends up being used to tell stories about quote unquote the way things are in the market. And it's important to understand like how you personally and your business fits into that and how it doesn't.
It's also very data in this market. In this industry, it's so important to how you process it and how you contextualize it and what those stories make sense, because it's really lumpy data. Even the galleries that sell the most volume, it like is nothing compared to what other businesses might sell. If you're selling car parts or other things like that, we've got real data, you can really get thrown off even over the course of a whole year based on several sales and things like that too. And often the difference at a fair between something that's a pretty good fair and something that's super successful is one amazing sale that's based on any number of like kind of uncontrollable and almost ephemeral factors. So it's knowing that and putting yourself always in a position to be to really be working hard for your artists and having those conversations happen that can lead from one way to the next. But whenever you look at data, you do gain really, really significant insights. But it's the contextualizing is so important, because I think we're even if we're really good at collecting data, they can be pretty small data sets relative to other industries.
I have an example of data that's very helpful, which is like, I think a lot about when I first started the gallery. All I really wanted to do was like, and I still really love Basel, Switzerland. I just like love that fair so much, and I just like wanted to be in there and be a part of it. And I ended up being a part of it and being eventually a part of the statements committee, which was like really like my dream job. If I could just be in the statements committee job, I'd like love it. I love reading everybody's, like, it's just fantasy situation. But unfortunately, if you look at my data, I have like 10 great German collectors. Like, why am I like, and I mean, it's because I love this community. I love the people. I love Basel. Like, sometimes data is good to just kind of sit down and be honest and be like, oh, right. Like, I'm 99% of my relationships are in New York City. And I think sometimes, I use this as just kind of an example that I think one thing that's really important is for us to responsibly look at the data and figure out what our narrative is and what our dreams are, and figure out how we can responsibly get there and still achieve all those things. I don't have any regrets. It's just, I think sometimes for my one words to the young galleries or the artists out there is just, it's a lot of pressure to be making a handful of objects a year and to expect to be an internationally renowned artist or gallery. It's a lot, and it's a long path to get there and take as much time as you need, I say. Yeah.
Cool. So we've got time for one question, which is, what one piece of advice would you give to the audience going into 2025? Jasmin, let's start with you.
Oh gosh. Everyone's talking about art and tariffs, but wine is going to be affected by tariffs too. So I highly suggest get a few crates. It's going to be a long year.
Stock up now. Nick?
I think really we can all get really sort of stuck in reading news and getting into our various files and really just like get out there and see as much. So it's something that within the gallery for myself too, it's like you can get really caught up in what you're doing and the people you're talking to and just trying to get out and see new things, even if it's just in the city, going around, and if you're in New York and seeing as many shows as possible, but try to expand our viewpoints as much as we possibly can. Maybe an important year for doing that. And also I think it'll be good for our sanity too. Like a couple crates of wine and getting out and seeing a lot of things and seeing people in person will definitely help us through 2025.
And Katey?
Yeah, maybe focus on bringing people together, because there is so much energy in that, like energy for each other and around the business. In energy, there's visibility, theoretically, hopefully there's money, but I think focusing on really making it a community and making it, how can you add value, and also how can it be fun for everyone?
And finally, Tim, what would your advice be?
I'm going to go back to something that we covered during the actual panel discussion portion, which is to say that I think that it's important to think back in our own histories about the fact that we've been through so much else already to get to this point, and that you can sort of, whether you're taking specific tangible lessons from moments of decisions in the past, or whether you're just sort of looking to fortify yourself for the fact that you know that the next year is going to be tough in some ways, it's really valuable to be able to go back and just sort of say, oh, I've done this before. Like I've made it through some really difficult points in my life or in my career, and I can do that again and again. Whether you're using the same strategies, that may or may not be the case, but I think there's just a sense that when you're going into something you know is going to be hard, it kind of there's a sense in which it can feel overwhelming, but you've probably already been through a bunch of other points in your life where it has also felt overwhelming and you managed to make it to the other side. So just sort of like taking some kind of inner strength or perspective from that might be helpful.
I think that is an excellent piece of advice for our last panel. Thank you so much to the entire panel, Tim, Katey, Nick, and Jasmin. It was a very insightful look on what we could maybe see coming up from 2025 and beyond. And don't forget to sign up to Tim's recently relaunched newsletter, The Grey Market, on Substack. You'll get some interesting insights as well from there. This was our final panel of the conference. I would like to thank all of the moderators and all of the panelists over the last 3 days. There have been so many wonderful discussions, thought-provoking moments, and some definite key actions that I think people can take away and do from today onwards. I would like to thank the entire team here at Artlogic who's made this possible. Our brand designer Hamish Whitworth and Jack Warden, who have been able to bring this conference to life online, and in particular Natasha Whiffen, our head of brand marketing and partnerships, who has been instrumental in putting these panels together and running the entire conference. From everyone here at Artlogic, thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next year at Artlogic Connect 2025. Thank you all very much.